The most dangerous story a pastor can tell is the one that sounds faithful, but doesn't force anything to change. And the reason that's so dangerous is because the stories that we tell ourselves are often not totally true. Listen, I did this too. I know a lot of pastors, and the ones that struggle, they don't struggle because they lack faith or effort or prayer, right? Many of the pastors who struggle, and this could be you, they struggle because they're carrying a pressure and they're struggling to name it, right? The church isn't collapsing, but it's not really moving either. The momentum kind of feels thin, energy feels really expensive. In clarity, it just feels like it's way harder to come by than it should. So when this happens, what do? We begin to explain it, right? We explain because we really desperately want to diagnose what's happening. So what we do is we tell ourselves things like it's just a season, that people are busy, that depth matters more than numbers, that God is pruning us, right? And listen, to be clear, any of that could be true and could be very valid explanations that are happening. But we often use those as a narrative to try to explain away what's actually happening. It's kind of this is really more about just pastors being humans and us kind of recognizing what humans kind of do. People, right? You, me, we're all meaning makers. We're always looking for meaning. Listen, we have done this our entire lives. It's baked into our DNA. Think about how when you were a kid, right? Or even as you look back on your childhood, there are things you don't understand. So what do? We try to make meaning of it. We tell the story that might not be totally true, and there's so much science behind this, but we tell the story that we wish were true, or we wanted to be true, or that we have now begun to believe is true because we've told it so many times. You see this in churches all the time. Churches, I think a lot of organizations are like this, but especially churches, we tend to be good news organizations. So when something good is happening, good metrics, dashboards, salvations, whatever, we celebrate success, but then we excuse away failures. We make excuses for things that aren't going well. So when momentum doesn't feel good, we blame culture. It was a rainy Sunday. We just had a snowy ice Sunday here in Atlanta, right? So of course that affects a lot. But it's easy to kind of make meaning of everything, including the things that aren't going well. So when we begin to make meaning, we accidentally can begin to tell stories or form narratives that aren't actually true, or at least fully accurate. And so when that kind of reality, begins to threaten our sense of competence or calling, it's hard not to make meaning and make it more positive, because we don't want to feel like it's our fault, or that, or we somehow have misinterpreted our calling, or we're not as competent as we thought, right? So our minds, they just naturally edit the story that's happening to confront the data that is happening too. And listen, that feels deceptive, but it is not deception. It's actually, again, like I said, it's human instinct. It's self-preservation. And so I think for pastors, this is an especially powerful instinct because ministry isn't just something that you do. It in a huge way, it is who you are. Now, I don't mean like in an identity replacing kind of way. I mean, child of God, adopted into the family, all of that identity piece is in place and should be in place. But your calling, this isn't a job. If it is, you would already be doing something else. So this is a calling. This is about obedience. It's about faithfulness, right? So when something like in the church isn't working, it can feel like a systems problem or a personal problem, right? If something isn't going the way it's supposed to go, like, what does it say about me? What does it say about my calling, about my ability, about my, pastor shepherdship, right? And so rather than kind of sit with those horrific questions, many pastors and leaders, we just unconsciously adjust the story. And you know what we do a lot? We see this all the time, especially in church. We begin to use faith language, right? Because faith language can quietly kind of become a cover. Faith language can easily be used to cover up reality. I mentioned some of these earlier. God's just pruning us. And again, maybe He is. Or maybe we're telling ourselves that and using a faith narrative because it sounds so spiritual. Faith really does feel more certain, right? That God is pruning us. I'll go back to that example. It feels certain. It feels kind of hopeful in a way. But the reality is that if that isn't true, if we're just using that language and creating a narrative to define or make meaning of what's actually happening, it's not real hope. It's just faux hope. And it begins to replace actual true clarity. And so then our calling ends up kind of being overridden and we're not even curious anymore. I mean, over time, right? Over time, the narratives that we tell ourselves explain everything. And when the narrative explains everything, here's the problem. Nothing has to change. Like the minute that we can explain away everything that's happening, good, bad, indifferent, we can explain away the loss of momentum. We can explain away why we haven't had a baptism in 12 months. We can explain away why our guest numbers are declining. We can explain, if we can make explanations for that, if we can form a narrative around that, then nothing has to actually change because we have an explanation. And this is such a problem, especially in church, right? It's a problem for us as leaders. Our model, therefore, doesn't have to change either. Our approach, our understanding of culture, we can just keep doing the same thing, status quo, and build a narrative around why nothing needs to change. That's the hidden cost of a protected story. And you probably sense this, and I know all this feels harsh, but it's built-in pride. It's really just built-in pride. I can tell you that I have led out of that space before. Early in my kind of pastorship. Okay, I was a lead pastor. Some of you know this for 13 years. I've been in ministry for 22 or whatever is 21 years now. I have had seasons, especially earlier in my leadership, which I do think it's more natural for a younger leader to fall prey to this. Not always, but it certainly feels more normative. Like in my pride, when things were going well, I wanted to take credit. And when things weren't going well, I wanted to make excuses and blame other people, blame culture, blame the community, blame the fact that we were in a shared facility, that we were, portable. I mean, there's so many things that you can blame. And really, that's just protecting your own story and not looking at it honestly. So I don't mean to be harsh in all this, but I do think it's important for us. I mean, this is just between us, right? I think it's important to recognize if we're being prideful in this, and if we are creating meaning by building a story that isn't actually true because it makes us feel better about what's actually happening. Because here's the deal. Most churches don't decline because the leader stopped caring. They decline because honesty feels risky, right? When problems go unnamed and patterns go unexamined. We do make narratives, but we don't really dig past the narrative, right? Data gets just dismissed or excused. People maybe want to give feedback, but we don't listen. It feels threatening. So therefore, any kind of better positive strategy or make it better kind of thing gets replaced with just, optimism and hope. And as you've heard me and so many other people say before, hope is not a strategy. But what happens in these churches, right, is the church just keeps busy and they were very sincere, and then they also grow exhausted because the fake story isn't fixing any actual problems. And of course, it doesn't take the church anywhere, and therefore, and this is the worst part, it doesn't move discipleship forward, individually or collectively. So here's something but I do want you to hear this, right? I want to say this so clearly. This is not a spiritual maturity conversation, okay? It's just leadership avoidance, kind of baptized in good intentions. And we all have good intentions. But being honest with ourselves, and you know this, right? We're the easiest person to lie to is ourselves, and being honest we're the hardest person to be honest with. But looking in the mirror, not through the window, but looking through the mirror and looking at the mirror and actually taking account of what's happening in reality with us, and in the organization or the ministry that we're leading is really critical for success. So how do you do that? Well, I mean, there certainly is a better way to lead in church, and it's just about really bravery, right? Bravery in leadership is not like brutal honesty. It's just intellectual honesty. We're not trying to be brutal. We're just trying to be honest, intellectually honest about what's happening. It's just telling the truest available story about what's actually happening without turning it into a verdict of your calling, of your identity, right? Like intentional leaders really do learn, and this is a spiritual maturity thing, but intentional leaders in the church and anywhere learn to separate identity from outcomes, right? They can say, this isn't working without also saying, I am a failure. That is very important because you can't make anything better, including yourself, if your identity is, connected to every outcome. Your identity is rooted in Christ. The outcomes are actually God's. I just preached on this at Southside Church last week, but our job is faithfulness. God's job is results. So without concluding I'm a failure, we can just be honest about what's happening. And we can say if something isn't working, if something needs to get better, if I need to get better. And when that separation happens, something powerful shifts in you as a leader, and it trickles through your church too. Pressure certainly decreases. Clarity begins to increase. Options and opportunities tend to expand. Energy returns. It's hard living out that narrative when we know in our heart it isn't fully true. It is an energy sucker, man, but energy begins to return. And leaders can stop kind of defending or trying to defend a story that they know isn't fully accurate and instead start addressing problems and designing a better future. So most breakthroughs in churches, listen, I didn't believe this a long time ago, but most breakthroughs in churches they don't begin with a better vision. They begin with truth. This is why when I am working with churches, especially when we're doing like leadership labs, one-day offsites, kind of initial conversations, one of the first things I ask is, what's happening really? I love that, really. Not don't tell me the story of what's happening. Don't tell me the narrative that you have decided is true. Show me the data. Show me the reality. What's happening really? What's happening with discipleship, with volunteering, with giving, with engagement, with groups, with all the different things that we do as a church? What's happening with private disciplines? How do we know? What's happening with prayer? Let's talk about the reality of what's happening. So let me just kind of, as we wrap up, give you like a simple but very practical starting point that you can use actually this week, okay? And I don't think you should do this publicly. You can, but you definitely don't want to do it performatively, okay? This is something that you should do kind of quietly and probably prayerfully. I'm going to give you 4 quick questions that you can ask, okay? Number 1, and again, this is between you and God, but be honest with yourself. Number 1, what story am I telling myself about our church right now? Like if somebody were to walk up to you on the street, you're at a church conference or wherever you may be, and hey, how's church going? What's the story that you would tell? Because that's probably the story you're telling yourself right now. Number 2, what evidence supports that story? If you can say out loud the story that you are telling yourself, is there evidence to support that reality, or is it a story that you are making up? Also, number 3, what evidence challenges that story? Is there any data or metrics or realities, right? And it can be anecdotal even. Or is there any evidence that challenges the story that you're telling? And last one, number 4, if fear were removed from the equation, from the conversation, what would you say differently? Like if you could completely separate your identity from the outcomes, if you could separate this calling that you have from the dashboards and the metrics and the story, if you could do that, what would you really say? Like, what would you say differently? How would you tell the actual story? That conversation alone, man, has been a turning point for so many pastors. And it's helped launch new, ideas. Those questions are better than any program or system or framework or anything, that you're going to come across. And the reason is because once the story becomes honest, hey, the next step becomes very clear. And that's really what we're trying to do. If we want to make our churches better, if we want to reach more people, convert more people, grow more disciples, grow depth of faith, if we want to do those things, we have to be honest about what's happening, because when we're honest, the problems become clear, and clear problems are solvable problems. That's really what intentional leadership is all about, right? It isn't about having a better story. It's about having a truer story. And leaders who are willing to face reality are often the very leaders God uses to write a better chapter next.